I think it's a very important meeting about illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing and the role of EU subsidies. This is something that we have organized together with the colleague Gerben-Jan GERBRANDY as part of our ALDE activities. I think this is a very important meeting because we're addressing two issues, really. One is the transparency as regards European funds, and secondly, a ban as regards any kind of illegal activity, in particular when it's damaging the environment, our wildlife, our natural environment. So I would like to thank in particular the Commissioner for Maritime Affairs and Fisheries, Ms. Maria Damanaki. Thanks a lot for being here because it underlines how important this meeting is and how important these issues are. And of course, we want to see how we can solve some of these problems. And I think it's most worthwhile what the commander from the General Command of Italy will have to say, Angelo Pistorio, who'll go into some of the details. So thank you very much for being here. Something else that I'm looking forward to hearing is what Jack Thurston has to say, who's here on behalf of fishsubsidies.org. And he's going to be telling us about when crime pays. And he's going to highlight the need for transparency in relation to public funds. And Marcus Knigge, who's here on behalf of a nonprofit organization, the Pew European Marine Program. And here it's a matter of closing the loopholes. And that's in particular as regards existing legislation and how it is important to disentangle public aid and IUU. Then Dr. Comfriel from the European Court of Auditors will be coming last but not least and report on the main findings of the Court of Auditors in regard of fisheries management. And he's going to be highlighting some of the shortcomings there. And hopefully the European Court of Auditors will be able to carry out a full investigation as regards the use of public money in this area. Then our colleague Gerben-Jan GERBRANDY, who is very much involved in the sector, will be providing us with the conclusions. He's the shadow rapporteur on the Environment Committee's opinion. This is the, actually it's fisheries area, combating IUU fisheries at the global level and the role of the EU. Now, before handing over the floor to our speakers, I would like to highlight the fact that even I myself, when I was acting as a public prosecutor in Calabria before I became an EP, there were some cases that would fit nicely on our agenda, where there were authorizations being given out, where organized crime was involved. Organized crime got involved in legal fishing activities with a view to getting hold of public money. So this is a very important phenomenon, not just in Italy, but throughout Europe. Now, as Mr. Gerben-Jan, I work in the Budgetary Control Committee, and we, of course, are keen on seeing our public money being spent properly on behalf of our citizens. So that's why I said transparency is a big concern here as well. Illegal fishing is a serious form of unfair competition. So it's undermining the market on behalf of scrupulous operators. not just that, it's hurting the environment. And we know what's happening in terms of our stocks, even being damaged by legal fishing. So our fishing resources, just let me tell you one thing, just taking 3 European countries, unfortunately, Italy is one of them, but also France and Spain, there's all kinds of money that went to fishing vessels that were sanctioned because they were caught fishing illegally. And it's worth highlighting also the engagement shown by the many organizations in Italy and elsewhere. Mari Vivo, Legambiente, we have a report that you can get hold of. There are copies here that have highlighted how bad the situation here. And there are vessels that have been subject to sanctions, but that notwithstanding, they've still gotten hold of the subsidies. So there's something wrong as regards the control mechanisms, and at the European level and at the national level. So even though they have been caught fishing illegally, they still go on getting European money because adequate and effective controls are not enforced by the member states. So from that angle, I do hope that our meeting will be useful, heighten awareness, that there be more of a political will to come to grips with this illegal criminal activity. So we need to consolidate the controls at the European level. What we have to do, in my view, is to see to it that there's adequate punishment enforced by the member states. These laws have to be complied with. And if when you've got systematic breaches in this area where you're hurting the environment, where public money is still going to these people, no, I think there's a real need for measures being taken. And it has to be at the European level with national enforcement. We're talking about organized crime, illegal activities, and there's sometimes legal vessels that are involved in arms trafficking, drugs trafficking, etc. So it's great to see how many of you have turned up this afternoon. So I'd like to thank you again, Maria Damanaki, for being here. And I'm afraid she's going to have to head off to another meeting, but the floor is yours, madam.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you for devoting your attention to illegal fishing today. Of course, it's my obligation to do my best in order to face this problem, but I'm very happy to see that now a lot of attention is attracted towards this issue. I would like also to thank the other very important speakers here in the panel. I'm afraid that I will not be able to attend all the speeches because I have to leave, but nevertheless, my services will be here and we are trying to do our best. So, in my intervention, I would like to focus on 3 points, specific points. Firstly, I would like to give you some figures and some examples of the costs of IUU fishing for society. Secondly, I will explain how we are trying now to make sure that EU funding does not directly or indirectly contribute to illegal fishing. This is something we are now trying, but I think we can be sure that the situation is improving. And I would like to refer both to the tools available now and to the upcoming reform of the common fisheries policy. And thirdly, I would like to address the global dimension of IUU fishing and see how the Commission aspires to tackle IUU fishing at a global level, because this is a global problem. So, first, let me say a few words about the direct and indirect economic costs of IUU fishing. As you know, the Commission is deeply now involved in the fight against illegal fisheries. Why? Well, I have often said here in the Parliament and in some other occasions that illegal fisheries is a crime. And this crime undermines the sustainability of fish stocks and marine ecosystems and causes general disruption to marine life. As stock levels keep declining, and this is true, this crime ends up affecting the whole sector. In the first place, illegal fisheries, they affect law-abiding fishermen, but in the long run, even those who currently profit from illegal activities. So illegal fishing has been and still is one of the major threats to fish stocks, undermining the very foundation of any fisheries policy. So, what is the economic impact of illegal fisheries? Calculating this economic impact is really difficult, and we don't have exact figures for the period after 2010, after we had this IUU regulation into force. But we have some research done prior to 2010, and this research suggests that IUU fishing was the second largest producer of fishery products in the world, worth approximately of 10 billion euros a year. 10 billion euros. This is an absolutely astonishing figure, making up almost 19%, 20% of worldwide catches. Sadly, and this is something we have already admitted, we have ourselves supported illegal fishing in the past. It has been estimated that 16% of EU imports, over €1 billion a year, came from illegal fisheries, as we know. So, as a key player in world fisheries, the EU has now taken an active role against IUU fishing at international level first, by actively proposing and supporting measures to improve controls and identify offenders, and within the EU by adopting the so-called IUU regulation. This regulation marks our commitment to fight illegal fishing, and we take its proper implementation and functioning very seriously. So what proper implementation means? It means, ladies and gentlemen, also that no EU subsidies go to EU operators who fish against the rules. I totally agree with Mr. De Magistris, who said that it's unacceptable to give taxpayers money for illegal fisheries. So we cannot grant public aid for a beneficiary who goes against the rules somewhere else with another vessel or under another flag. That would make no sense, and this is our effort now. Because, to be honest with you, it's easier to go and fight against illegal fisheries at our member states, but we also have to face the situation where we have a vessel, for example, by an EU citizen owner who is owner of this vessel, and then on this vessel we have a captain from another country, or we have fishermen from another country, and afterwards this vessel goes to another country, to a port, and lands there what they fish. So this is a very complicated situation. So the EU legislation adopted over the last few years already provides for clear responsibilities and obligations in this respect. Under the European fisheries rules, member states are responsible for selecting projects and beneficiaries and for performing checks and audits on the projects themselves or on their financials. With that information, it is up to member states to make sure that no aid is granted to unlawful operators. On top of that, the new regulation now forbids member states to grant any public money, whether from national or EU sources, to operators whose vessels are listed on our blacklist. The EU blacklist currently contains vessels listed as IUU by regional fisheries management organizations. They come to us with this data. But it can and will also include other vessels flagged both EU and non-EU countries, and I promise you that EU vessels will not receive any favorable treatment. A good example I would like to give to you, to be concrete, is a recent case we had. The French authorities have denied aid to a French owner to scrap a purseiner. This was a fact. This is a fact. Why? Because the seiner's owner also owned another vessel, this one appearing on the blacklist of the ICAT organization. So we had a success. Of course, it's just one success, and there are a lot of cases that we have to attend. But nevertheless, we had a success. That's why you see me so happy. On my request, member states are ascertaining, as we speak, if any vessels flagged to third countries but owned by EU nationals are engaged in illegal activities. If so, they will have to sanction them, suspend any aid, and put the vessels in question on the blacklist. Products from these vessels won't be landed into EU territory anymore. Member states will report to the Commission on the outcome of all these investigations. Finally, we have yet another instrument, the Control Regulation, which also enables the Commission to withdraw or suspend aid to member states which fall short of their responsibilities. Ladies and gentlemen, you will agree perhaps with me that this is a very good start, but we can do more, and we have to do even more. We could send an even clearer message that only those fishermen who fully comply with the rules can receive financial assistance from the EU. One way to do that is introducing more stringent criteria for the selection of the projects. These criteria should make sure that beneficiaries comply with all the rules of the common fisheries policy. The link between IUU regulation and financial assistance would then be made upstream already before the aid is allocated. So this will be our aim, to prevent the allocation of the aid, because afterwards it will be very difficult to suspend it. So, how can we do this? In the framework of the reform of the common fisheries policy, we have a perfect opportunity to do this. No EU funding should help or contribute to, directly or indirectly, IUU fishing. EU assistance should be governed by a single financial instrument and should be subject to a strong conditionality clause. This requires additional eligibility and selection criteria for both projects and potential beneficiaries. To have their project selected for funding, for instance, vessel owners could be required to prove that none of their vessels are listed on our IUU vessel list. In addition, to be eligible beneficiaries would have to meet all obligations of the IUU regulation for the whole period of project implementation. If not, payments will be suspended or withdrawn. Such conditionality will ensure that operators engaged in IUU fishing never benefit from EU funding. We are now working to secure this in the framework of our new funding control. Ladies and gentlemen, the results of our IUU regulation are already here. 90 of our trading partners are using the catch certification scheme. EU member states work now with each other and with the Commission to control incoming trade and check that those declarations are indeed true, because this is the problem we face now. We have moved towards a catch certification scheme. Now we have to work on the quality of these certifications to be sure that these certifications are indeed true, and this is our next step. We are confident that closing one of the biggest markets in the world to IUU, it will produce it will produce a great damage to illegal operators, and we hope that we are making a difference at a global level. So this is the way we're going to work in the coming years. However, we know that dishonest fishermen will continue to operate as long as they can and as long as it is profitable. Illegal fishing is a global problem, and to be honest, we cannot face it alone. Illegal fishing is affecting all countries on all continents. So if we really want to put an end to IUU fishing worldwide, we have to work, it will not be an easy task, of course, we have to work through an international effort. Only by an international effort we can be sure that we'll have some real success. So I have already an idea of what the next step should be, and I am determined to pursue it through the adequate regional fisheries organizations. In my opinion, we should adopt a worldwide catch certification system. Only after the adoption of this worldwide certification system, with the cooperation of United Nations and with cooperation of the big partners in fishing area, United States, Canada, Japan, Russia, China, and also in cooperation with the regional fisheries management organizations throughout the world, only then we can be sure that we can have a worldwide catch certification system, a reliable one. A global catch certification regime would be extremely effective. It will improve the control of fishing activities carried out in any waters, not only in our waters, and of the produce marketed in all countries in the world. I believe such a worldwide program would bring about a fair trade in fisheries products. So this will be the future, a fair trade in fisheries products. It will foster an international commitment to combat this crime and would ultimately bring us closer to responsible fishing and sustainable world fisheries. So I would like very much to receive your proposals on this way forward. Thank you.
Grazie, ringrazio.
Thank you ever so much, Commissioner Damanaki, Commissioner for Maritime Affairs and Fisheries. Yes, I think you've confirmed what we know, that yes, that there is an awareness here. As said earlier on, we really have to do away with these kind of contradictions. On the one hand, there's this heightened awareness in Europe when it comes to the need to fight illegal fishing. And on the other hand, there's this European money that's there, that's going to vessels that includes vessels involved in illegal fishing. So there's a lot of illegal activity going on. And I think pressure from the European institutions vis-a-vis the member states and also vis-a-vis the regional fishing management organizations is required, because we're not just talking about individual fishers involved in illegal activity, you're talking about organized crime. So thanks again, Commissioner. And I think at this juncture it would be very good to hear what Captain Angelo Pistorio has to say here. He's here from the General Command of the Court of Port Captaincies of the Italian Coast Guard and involved in fighting IUU fishing. So I think that what we're going to hear will be of the utmost relevance to all of us.
Good afternoon. I wanted to take this opportunity to thank you for having me and for giving me this opportunity as the representative of the Corps of the Port Captaincies to talk about one of our main and yet most sensitive activities. I fighting the use of drift nets. Now, the purpose of this presentation is to provide a brief overview of the Italian body that controls fishing, and also talk about illegal fishing. I also want to give you some idea of the concrete results that we have achieved during the last 6 years. Fishing in Italian comes under the Ministry for Agriculture and Fisheries. Now, when it comes to controlling fishing, that's carried out by the General Command of the Corps of the Port Captaincies. There's a national unit for fisheries control under this command, and it has a dual function. It carries out national level operations and also local level operations, and also manages the monitoring of vessels through the VMS system, which is the vessel monitoring system used for fishing boats. Now, as well as the CCNP, there is a department within the ministry which deals more with the administrative and legal side of fishing. So, going back to the CCNP, as we said, it coordinates and manages data, because we became aware that data management is essential when it comes to intelligence and control activities. We need to have the data relating to the vessels that most often commit crimes, because once we have that, we can come up with a risk matrix by which we can plan our interventions. We carry out various operations, and these take place on the sea, but also on land. And on land we kind of follow the line of where fish are sold, the distribution line. Now, we have 15 control centres within the CCNP, and they operate on a regional basis, and they act in a coordinated manner when the central body carries out an overall generalised operation. We receive information on the movements of fishing vessels on a daily basis, and this particularly relates to vessels that carry out illegal fishing activities. And from there, from that information, we then plan our operations. I will try and be brief with all of this. Now, these kinds of activities, i.e. monitoring activities, are based on on-site intelligence, cross-checking data, and also post-activity reports. And following all of these steps, we come up with a risk analysis. So, on land operations then. The main objective is to take care of consumers. Sometimes imports come in from other countries and they're not checked, and they can damage consumers' health. So we try and work with the health bodies of the area in question, and they are trained to deal with these situations. And we also try and safeguard national products and small-scale fishing that operates legally. It is often this kind of fishing that is damaged by illegal fishing activities. So I was talking about land-based operations, and we carry out our checks either from a health or commerce point of view. We also look at labelling, we look at documents in general, we look at the traceability of goods, and we also check goods that come in from abroad. Let's move on to sea-based activities. And the most important thing that we do on a daily basis is to check undersized catch and catches of juvenile fish. This is completely banned. And we also check for fishing of stocks that are endangered, and in this case I'll talk about bluefin tuna. Now, pursuant to community regulation, the community regulation on the Mediterranean, we work on the use to ensure that legal fishing equipment is used. And here we're talking about mesh size, we're talking about long line, the use of long liners, and we're also talking about the protection of various fish species, particularly those that are most affected by the use of drift nets. Currently, in Italy, our checks are based on plans which aim to care for endangered species, particularly bluefin tuna. As I said, there's a great deal of pressure on bluefin tuna stocks in Italy, and we have to monitor all kinds of activities that are carried out by fishing vessels involved in fishing for bluefin tuna. The fact is that fishing for bluefin tuna is also related to the use of drift nets, which is what we're talking about today. Now, with regard to drift nets, a yearly plan has been drawn out which points out suspect vessels, vessels that have received punishments, and all activities that are carried out within ports. The various units are activated based on this plan, and that's the starting point for our activities to fight against the use of illegal drift nets. Now, the main season runs between April and November, and it's then that these drift nets are used. In October and November they're a little less used, but during the central period, it was mainly during the season, there is a great deal of these nets are used a great deal, or they were at one point. But to understand what's going on, you have to look a little bit at history. Now, culturally, fishing vessels, fishing fleets that used and use drift nets are those from the south of Italy, particularly those from Sicily, Calabria, Campania, and some of them from the Lazio region. As I said, May to September is when most of this fishing goes on. So, what are the rules and regulations that are applied? There are three sectors to this. Let's divide it into three sectors. We have international law, banning drift nets through the UN resolution. There's a total ban on using drift net equipment, and also a ban on drift nets, wide mesh drift nets in particular, decreed by the EU. And these are the international rules that support our policing activities. We do also have national level regulations, and this is where the penalties that we can apply come from. This is also how these international rules are applied. We're going to see how things have changed, but in the past there were two kinds of drift nets used. There were spadare drift nets and ferretara nets. Now, spadare, 10 or 15 kilometers long, they're placed in the sea in a current, and they have a wide mesh size. It's over 20 centimeters going from knot to knot of the mesh. And these are the most damaging nets because they drift with the currents, and they're veritable death traps where cetaceans, swordfish, tuna and other kinds of large animals get trapped. And they're also very dangerous for shipping. There's another kind of net which is known as a ferretara net. This has smaller mesh. It cannot be over... it's shorter in size. It can't be over 2.5 kilometers long. It's used nearer to the coast, and its mesh size is below 18 centimeters. You're not allowed to catch tuna or swordfish with this kind of net. So basically they're used to catch smaller kinds of fish which aren't from endangered stocks. And in this case we're talking about bluefin tuna, as I mentioned previously. So, punishments. Illegal fishing with drift nets is an administrative receives an administrative penalty. It's not a criminal penalty that it gets unless undersized fish or juvenile fish are caught. So first of all, the equipment is taken away, and then there is a fine which is around about between 2,000 and 4,000 euros. But the most important thing is the confiscation of the equipment. So the equipment's taken off the owner who was carrying out illegal fishing and is destroyed. In addition, there are another two specific rules. One is pursuant to Law 65, which envisages the suspension of the fishing permit of the fishermen involved, as long as the fine hasn't been paid. Once the fine has been paid, then the application process to get the the permit suspended is broken off. There's another rule which suspends the fishing vessel from going out fishing. Now, these measures can be in conflict sometimes, but that's something we'll see at the end. The Italian state has launched a process to try and improve the sanctions system. So I told you about the two kinds of nets, spadara and ferretara. One is completely banned and one is allowed within a certain distance from the coast and to fish a certain numbers of species, to fish for certain species of fish. So where's fishing carried out? Pretty much in the southern half of the country. And it's usually carried out when species of migratory fish are going past the southern parts of Italy. And as I said previously, the main areas are Sicily, the Aeolian Islands, Calabria and Sardinia. There is a bit of fishing in Campania and Lazio as well. There are some areas that have been pointed out as being areas where more fishing takes place, and as you can see, they're close to ports that host vessels that use drift nets. There are various ports in question. In Sicily you have Palermo and various small ports. Previously they used to openly use drift nets, but now they try and hide their use. We also have the famous case of Bagnara Calabra, and this is a port that's famous for fishing using drift nets. A great deal of progress has been made there too, particularly with regard to banning the spadara nets. These are some just a few examples of how the nets were shown in public just 6 years ago. These are the Aeolian Islands. This was Bagnara Calabra that I mentioned before, Marina de Camerota on the mainland. How do we fight the use of drift nets? We do it in two ways. First of all, direct activities. We send out a plane, we see the vessel carrying out its activities, and then we confiscate the equipment. And the other is through remote activities. I mentioned the satellite system to control vessels, the VMS. Each vessel that is over a certain length has something called a blue box that transmits its position and speed. When we receive these signals, we can tell which kind of fishing it's carrying out. A boat that maintains a certain speed of 2 or 3 knots and maintains a certain course is using a drift net, is carrying out, is probably a trawler, and boats that are doing different speeds and going different directions are more likely to be using drift nets. As I said previously, all of this information, all of this data is put into a monitoring system that was established, and this has information on all vessels that are fishing, whether legally or illegally, and all of this is cross-checked with any punishments or administrative sanctions or anything else, any other reports that have been drawn up on them, and that's what we base our investigations on. These are the 14 areas into which Italy is split, in which our remote surveillance is carried out. You can see Naples, Reggio Calabria, Sicily and so on, and you can see they're all basically concentrated into one area. Those are the areas that are the highest risk areas for Italy. I was talking about the VMS system as well. We have two kinds of system in Italy, and this is perhaps what people don't know. We have images on screen which come from cameras that are placed on vessels. We have two systems that have been joined together. One relates to merchant shipping and one relates to fishing vessels. Usually illegal fishermen hide the transmission signal. They try and jam the signal coming out, and they're trying to ensure that the signal doesn't reach the unit on land, so we can't tell that they're fishing. But what we do receive is the signals from other vessels that are fishing legally. We also receive signals from vessels passing through the area where we believe there might be some illegal fishing going on. There's a great deal of experience and knowledge that goes into that work. Now, we plot the courses of large ships, merchant ships, and for example, we can see that they take a certain course, and then we can tell that they're trying to avoid some kind of obstacle. Now, of course, the obstacle is a drift net, because if it gets stuck in their propellers, then it causes problems and the ships are forced to stop. Once we've seen where the punishment's taking place, we send out a plane that pinpoints the location of the vessel that is carrying out the illegal fishing. Now, from a legal point of view, we have to catch the vessel red-handed. So this is what happens. The plane spots the vessel. It communicates its position to one of our naval units. It passes the information to the boats. They board the vessel and they confiscate the equipment and take the vessel back to port. That's what happens during a normal operation. Now, the fact is that various things go on in the south of Italy. Let's leave it at that. And the fact is that when expensive equipment is confiscated, they often send out members of their family and so on, and friends, and start to cause difficulties for those who've confiscated the stuff. But the equipment generally it is confiscated, and we've noted during recent seasons that there has been an increase in bluefin tuna and a decrease in the amount of swordfish around. So these kind of vessels obviously change their targets when it comes to what they're fishing for. So once we've done that, we draw up our reports, we identify the people, we identify the vessels, and all this information goes to the central unit and goes into our IT module, where there is a database of all crimes that are committed in the fisheries sector. And this is all to establish this the aforementioned risk analysis, which is then used for any subsequent operations. Let's have a look at some of the results that we've achieved between 2005 to 2009. We'll look at 2010 in a minute. You can see that the graph goes up to 2007. And that shows that there were more spadare nets and fewer ferratare nets. But as we started to act, also through sanctions, because we sometimes confiscated fishing vessels, we haven't done that a great deal, but for fisheries crimes, but for other reasons. For example, when a fishing vessel resists what we're doing because we're military, we're linked with the Navy, then we can confiscate the vessel when the fishermen resist confiscation. So you can see that over the years ferretara nets have increased in number and spadara nets have decreased in number. And then in 2009 you can see that there are twice as many ferretara nets as spadara nets. So these are the results. We spotted 283 vessels. Of these, 89 had received reconversion subsidy. 37 were reoffenders, i.e. they'd been spotted carrying out illegal activities more than once, and we're talking about over 2,000 kilometres of netting that we confiscated. It's an enormous figure. 2010. In 2010, we closed down. We stopped the purse seiners who were fishing for bluefin tuna from going out, and we noted that many boats that were based in Sicily and Calabria went elsewhere, and I think that suggested that the species being fished for were changing. Another important element is that the Calabrian fleets gave us their drift nets because it seems that this time they really had decided to stop fishing with illegal equipment, and they gave us 300 kilometres worth of drift nets. So this is these are the movements of the ships. The Sicilian boats were going north and towards Sardinia. A new department was established, a national coordinator was appointed, and all operations were carried out on the at the national level. No local level operations were carried out at all in 2010. So essential features. 50 kilometres worth of drift nets confiscated just in one port near Salerno. And in Puglia, we confiscated 500 bluefin tuna, each weighing 1 kilo. And all of these were caught with drift nets. We managed to pinpoint certain areas between Campania and Lazio. Some of them are in the north of Calabria, and just a few areas north of Palermo where this kind of drift net fishing still goes on. So you can see that the areas where this kind of stuff goes on are not as widespread as previously. These are our results. 47 confiscations, 112 kilometres of drift nets confiscated. You can see there's a vast difference on the 2005 figure, and 46 crimes that were discovered. So what's happened, we think, is that Spadara nets have almost disappeared, and Ferretara nets have become more and more used. And we also think that swordfish are being more fished now than bluefin tuna. So the fleets moved away. When these vessels are caught with a net, an illegal net, they just drop it into the sea, so they're not caught. And again, a decrease in the use of Spadara nets and an increase in the use of Ferretara nets. Right, so let's move on to the final conclusion. What has the Italian state done? Very recently, there has been an amendment to Law 963, which proposes an extension of a suspension from 3 to 6 months and the withdrawal of a person's fishing permit if they reoffend. That's what the Italian state proposed in 2010. So that's enough from me. We'd like to thank Commander Pistoio for his comments on how Italy fights illegal fishing. Before continuing, I'd like to urge you to read the report from the Italian associations on illegal, on IUU fishing, and also the report from the Pew Environment Group, More Environment Group. I found that very interesting, and it was really that which stimulated me to organise this meeting. Another thing I should point out is that illegal fishing has extremely high environmental costs for the entire ecosystem. There are also enormous economic costs, and it also produces high social costs because there's less employment in the legal fishing sector. Let me now give the floor to Jack Thurston from fishsubsidies.org. He's going to talk about when crime pays, subsidies, illegal fishing and transparency, and I'd like to urge all our speakers to please stay within their allotted 15 minutes so we have time for discussion at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman, members of the European Parliament, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Marcus, are you able to pull up? It's on the desktop somewhere. It's on the desktop. There we go.
Is that one the one?
Yep.
It's a PDF?
Yep. And then if you go into Fenêtre, and then plein écran.
Sorry?
Mode plein écran. Down, down, down. Voila. And one back. I'll take the device. Right. Forgive me. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present the work that I and my colleagues have been doing on trying to bring greater transparency to European Union fisheries policies, not only the subsidies but also the enforcement of rules. I am the co-founder of a website called fishsubsidy.org with a group of activists and journalists and computer programmers, and we are part of a growing ecosystem of non-governmental actors, civil society if you like, who are advocating for more open budgets, more government transparency and more civil society oversight into public policy. Obviously, the primary responsibility for enforcement of the law goes with the police and, in this case, coast guards. And so it was very fascinating to hear the presentation of Commander Pistorio, who is really at the front line of this too. But in addition to the activities of the official law enforcement agencies, there is something that can be done by civil society. And whether that's in terms of bringing things out into the public arena, drawing policymakers to attention to look at loopholes and inconsistencies in the policy. So a couple of years ago, we launched a website called fishsubsidy.org, surprisingly enough. We just stick to one name for everything, it helps. And this presented on the internet all the fisheries subsidies from the FIFG instrument from the year 1999 to 2006 at the level of end beneficiaries on a website that was searchable. And last year we added a map that would allow people to see where the expenditure goes and zoom down to individual ports and even to individual recipients within those ports to really get a feeling for where this money is going, which vessels are benefiting. And you can see we have pages on the website detailing the fish subsidies to individual vessels, including full details, or as far as we can get, on the vessel concerned. At the bottom of the page, you can see it says, add information for this recipient. And this is a very important element of our project. We have information that we obtain from, in this case, the European Commission on who gets the money. But it's important that we add information to that data, particularly on whether that vessel has been involved in illegal fishing or not. And this is information that is not contained within the data on subsidies, and so it has to be added. And so it's open to the public to add information and source it wherever possible to describe not only whether the vessel is involved in illegal fishing, but whether the vessel is targeting endangered stocks or anything else that might be important or relevant. We did a study, Marcus Kniger, who will speak after me, that was published last March and updated this March, basically taking reports in the media and in courts of illegal fishing activity, essentially convictions data, and matching it against subsidies data to ask the question, are the same vessels which are being subsidized also being convicted of illegal fishing? And we found in this, this study that there were cases, and it's important to note that the data on illegal fishing is very, very difficult to come by. There are no central data sets. I don't believe the European Commission has published its blacklist. We essentially had to go around media reports, local newspapers, some court reporting, some governmental reports in countries that did publish information on convictions to collect what is essentially a snapshot of the situation, not by any means a definitive picture. But even with this very limited amount of data on convictions, we were able to find that there were 75 law-breaking vessels that between them had received 20 million in European Union subsidies. Perhaps most disturbingly, given the remarks that the Commissioner made, 14 of those cases involved EU subsidies being paid after the conviction of the vessel for illegal fishing. So a couple of cases. It's a picture that's been recycled from the previous presentation, but you can see it a little bit bigger there. It's a good one, isn't it, from Greenpeace. This one may be particularly interesting for Mr. Chairman. The Orazio 2 in Calabria. The timeline is there. Subsidized to convert its drift nets to other gear, and then reported as still using drift nets, awarded a significant EU grant for modernisation, and then finally caught not once but twice with 11 kilometres of legal drift nets. Another one from Sicily, the same kind of story. I won't go into it because you can read it on the screen. Okay, so vessel in Spain. This one here. The story here goes that this is essentially a vessel that we paid for because it was funded with a subsidy for construction, not just a European Union subsidy, but match funding from the Spanish government. So this is a kind of, I guess this is a nationalised fishing vessel. Caught using illegal gear, and then 5 years later awarded a grant that surprisingly is very similar to the fine, although I imagine it was also matched with Spanish national government funding as well. So this kind of analysis is only as good as the data that's available. And for the period 1994 to 2006, we had a reasonably good data set provided to us by the European Commission, looking at that explained which vessels got what money and why. And we were able, with this information, to match against a variety of things, including illegal fishing. Moving forward, we're in a much worse situation. Usually things get better over time, particularly in this field of transparency, where more and more governments are seeing transparency as something that's important. But in this case of fisheries, things are getting very much worse. And I think the Commission bears a great deal of responsibility for this, and therefore it's disappointing that the Commissioner has not spent as much time listening as she did addressing us. But that's the way with Commissioners, I suppose. They are busy people, after all. We have the European Transparency Initiative, which now governs the provision of this kind of information. And we have been monitoring the implementation of this, and I have to say the signs are very bad. First of all, the data is presented all over the place, 27 more, 35, 40 different websites around the European Union. Each member state seems to be publishing a different data in a different format. Often it's in PDF files, which if anyone who's worked with data knows is very problematic. And most importantly, for us in terms of analysing this kind of thing in relation to illegal fishing, there is no vessel registration number information. So we can't actually find out which vessel these are definitively, because if you look at vessel name, you only get so far because vessels often have the same name. I don't know how many Santa Maria vessel names there are in Italy, but I imagine it's more than one. With the vessel registration number, you're able to identify exactly which vessel you're talking about. So it's very poor. And I won't present too many motivations for why it's poor, but just describe the fact that it is poor. And here I'll introduce you to the three so-called wise monkeys: see no evil, hear no evil, and speak no evil. And this is really very much the situation that we're facing in relation to subsidies and illegal fishing in the European Union. Under Article 40 of the EFF regulation, the Commission does have the power to ask for information from Member States about the end beneficiaries of European Union funds. Amazingly, it doesn't appear to have done that. And that's why I'm extremely surprised about that, to receive that confirmation in a letter from the Commissioner last month. And I would have loved to have asked her why, given that all she said about how important it is to enforce the rules, why the Commission isn't even bothering to ask for the data on who gets the money. So at least it can do a few checks, or even lots of checks, to ensure that Member States are doing what they're meant to be doing. So if the Commission is keeping its eyes closed to the problem, It means that people in this place, the European Parliament, are unable to talk about it because you don't have information to talk about the problem, to address it, which is what's meant to happen in this place. And the public doesn't hear about it. And civil society is unable to mobilize public opinion and get the story sufficiently high up in the political arena and the political agenda to make something happen to improve the situation. And it's a matter of great regret that this is where we are, but this is where we are, and so I hope you'll forgive me for some plain talking today, this afternoon, but thank you for the opportunity to present our work.
Grazie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thurston. That was very interesting. Thanks for giving us those concrete examples. And also, I appreciate the fact that you mentioned Calabria, that those vessels, and that was the case I was referring to when I was a prosecutor in Calabria in 2007. And something else you mentioned that I think is fundamental is the role of civil society, that people have to be vigilant, the communities there. They have to realize how important all this is. Also, the impact that it's had on bluefin tuna, etc. So, yes, we do want to raise awareness in the Parliament as well. Now, over to Marcus Knigger from the Pew European Marine Programme, closing the loopholes, disentangling public aid and IUU. Please.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm Marcus Knigger from the Pew Environment Group, and we are also a member of the steering group of a coalition called Ocean 2012, which gathers together more than 115 groups working on the reform of the common fisheries policy. And it's a great opportunity to be here. I would like to open up the picture a little bit more. I personally come more from the subsidies angle rather than from the IU angle to the debate. And I spent some years on working on fishery subsidies, mainly because these subsidies support overcapacities, and they again are identified as one of the key drivers for overfishing. So in the end, we have some subsidies that are recognized to be environmentally harmful and subsequently also economically and socially harmful, because there's less fish in the sea. So the following presentation is focusing a little bit more on the link between subsidies and overcapacity, and then goes into the more legal arena with respect to IUU. So I talk a little bit about overcapacity as a driver for overfishing. Overcapacity is, of course, also one of the drivers of IUU fishing. The link between subsidies and overcapacity, and then I'm going to conclude with some policy conclusions. And I hope not to take all the 15 minutes to allow some questions afterwards, or at the end some time for discussion. Overcapacity has been recognized by the European Commission as one of the fundamental problems of the current CFP. So this is one of the key issues. I think also some other publications, the Court of Auditors has also something to say on overcapacities. That this is really one of the main issues. And it's very difficult to measure. At the same time, there are some estimates that in certain fisheries, the fishing fleet can exert a fishing pressure that is 2 to 3 times the sustainable level. And that results in a situation which is more than suboptimal, mainly that the majority of EU fish stocks are overfished. At the same time, overcapacity is also driving IUU fishing. Here's a quote that came from the House of Lords report, where one of the permanent representatives said that it becomes a little bit awkward if fishing vessels can basically fish all they are allowed to fish in a couple of days. And I made an attempt to show that this is not an insignificant problem also within EU waters, but I have to point out that these data that I display there was research commissioned by the Pew Environment Group. It's old. It was published in 2008, so before the entry into force of the control on the IU regulation. But at that stage, we had significant, some estimates. Of course, it's always difficult to make these estimations, but some estimates of significant amounts of illegal activity in European waters. And I think it's very important to keep in mind that IUU is not only a problem of some fishing operations, fishing on the high sea or in third countries, but this is very much also a problem of EU operators, EU vessels in EU waters. It's a complex table, and I'm not going into the details, but basically what we asked a research institute called Poseidon was to analyze the spending of the FIFG 2000 to 2006. And what we asked was, in particular, if they could establish a link between those vessels that received subsidies for modernization and construction, or also for scrapping, and the fish stocks they target. Because in the end, ultimately, we care about the state of fish stocks in particular, of course also about the marine environment, but that is the clearest link. And what the research found out was that there's on several occasions fleets that target overfished stocks that still receive substantial amounts for modernization and at that time still construction. Construction aid is phased out, as most of us know here in the room, but there is still aid for modernization out there under the European Fisheries Fund. And there's very little indication that the situation has changed. We have some current research going on application forms at member state level, and it doesn't seem that lots of member states ask for any information on what fish do you actually target. And that ends up in situations like the bluefin tuna fleet, and it's one of the examples that was brought up by a parliamentary question here in the Parliament, where the answer by the Commission was that the EU bluefin tuna fishing fleet received between 2000 and 2008 34.5 million euros for modernization and total of 34.5 million, and out of that 33.5 million for construction and modernization. I think most of us in the room know about the state of bluefin tuna. Most of us have heard some rumors about the amount of illegal activities surrounding that fishery, and it seems very difficult to conceive that taxpayers' money should be used to modernize or at that time even build up that fleet. I'm not sure where the discussions are at the moment, but you also know that as soon as you want to reduce tax and quotas on that fishery, usually the first reaction of some very limited people in the sector are almost like an automatic reflex to ask for further subsidies, because now they don't have any fishing opportunities anymore. So there we have a nice circle. First we build up the fleet with subsidies, we face a collapse of a fishery or close to a collapse. We have lots of illegal activities, then there might be more control and more enforcement, and basically the first reaction is please give us more public money. So what could be done about it? And I think one was already mentioned, and it's clear we could use the existing instruments in a better way or in a more rigorous way. The European Commission could enforce member states' reporting requirements. Most member states fail to adequately report on their efforts to establish a balance between their fleet capacity and fishing opportunities. And as a result, we don't know where the overcapacities are. If we don't know where the overcapacities are, but member states continue to spending money on modernization, we are very likely to spend money on existing overcapacities. So we are actively contributing to maintaining overcapacities with public aid. It was already mentioned in the beginning that the EU should definitely fully enforce the IUU regulation on all EU vessels operating not only outside EU waters but also internally. And I think there's a little bit it's the next article. I think there's a little bit this discussion, and I'm sure that we might have an opportunity in the discussion later on. But basically, if I understand correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, there are two different types almost of illegal fishing. One is illegal fishing that is not sufficiently pursued by the member states, and those vessels end up on the IUU vessel list. And there are very clear there's very clear legislation. Those vessels that are on the IUU vessel list, they are excluded from benefiting from public aid. There's no EU vessel currently on the IUU vessel list. If I'm not mistaken, it's even the council that is setting up that list. It's agreeing on who is on that list. I'm not sure about it. No, sorry. Anyway, I'm not sure how many vessels are there on the list at the moment. 20, 30.
At this moment, we have no EU vessel in the first list that we. Sorry. I don't know if I speak French or English.
Whatever.
Ok, merci. Oui, bonjour. D'abord.
Yes, thank you. Valori. I'm in charge of the regulations for control in IUU. I'm representing the commissioner. So just a question when it comes to the lists of the IUU vessels. The first information I can give you is this is an initial list. Next month, there's going to be 80 vessels that we've identified on the basis of the regional management organizations. There's a second list that's been worked on at present. The European Commission with the member states is checking up on 70 vessels. And some of those are flying community flags. So that list will be available by this summer. So the IUU regulation, and this is the commissioner's promise, also will be covering these vessels that operate in the high seas with community waters. So at present we're checking up on this, and the second list will have been adopted by this summer. And there certainly will be community vessels on that list. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I think what the misunderstanding is a little bit that a large number of vessels seriously infringe the rules of the CFP, but they do not end up on the IUU list. And I think that is a little bit a general misunderstanding potentially in the room, and that is where we are coming from. It's not about those vessels that fulfill a number of criteria and therefore end up on the IUU list, but it's all those vessels that infringe the CFP, that do not comply with the rules of the common fisheries policy, and all those vessels should be excluded from benefiting from aid. The current provisions are that member states have an opportunity as an additional sanction to exclude these infringers from subsidies. But to my knowledge, there's no, I don't know from any member state that it's actually doing it. And I also don't know from any commission activity to have a look if member states actually apply this Article 45(7). Of course, there are other provisions, including the control regulation that was already mentioned, to withhold aid from those member states that do not adequately enforce the CFP. I think there are other things that can be done. As Jack mentioned, one could just ask for the information, where does the money actually go? These are all legal provisions that are there. Some of them are more difficult potentially to implement. Some of them are very easy. It's a letter to ask for the information. Commissioner Damanaki already mentioned that this is an important timing of the debate, because we have an opportunity to change the situation, and a number of instruments, in particular the next subsidy regime, is currently being drafted within the European Commission. And I think there are a number of policy recommendations that should be there for the future aid. One of them being, in the first place, to eliminate the driver of overfishing and the driver of illegal activities, which are subsidies maintaining or increasing overcapacities. It's similar aid for access to fish resources. This is particularly the access payments under the fisheries partnership agreements. And there should be a general shift from payments to individual vessels or individual operators to public services. For civil society organizations like the Pure Environment Group, it's very difficult to understand that the funding priorities of the European Commission are rather to put 1 billion a year to individual owners under the European Fisheries Fund or under the fisheries partnership agreements, and only 50 million a year to control and enforcement. Similarly, only 50 million a year to data collection, if I'm not, even less. I think it's 43 million a year. But if you look at these priorities, it's very difficult to understand why public money should, in the first place, end up in the pockets of individuals. If you look at certain research, and I have copies of them over there, it's usually the big ones, rather than contributing to maintaining public goods, which is in the end a control enforcement system. And of course, information should be transparent on subsidies, hopefully also on infringement at some stage. In case there is aid for individuals, I think there are again also two things one can do. And that is on one hand, of course, making first of all the receiving aid conditional upon compliance with the rules. But you could also introduce a clause that infringements after the receipt of subsidies could lead to recovery of those subsidies. That could be done at least, of course, within the framework of proportionality, but for a number of years that could be done as another disincentive to embark on illegal fishing. And just as a summary of the conclusions, it's really, we have a number of good instruments at hand, in particular good if they are used, and they should all be used. There should be a clear shift in the future financing regime, hopefully, from towards public services, and I think there's a clear need, as shown by a number of these cases, to ensure full cross-compliance, and that not only ex post, but also not only ex ante, but also ex post. Thank you for your attention.
Grazie.
Thank you very much for all of those comments and your emphasis on how significant all this is when it comes to the amounts, the public funds we're talking about here. And then your proposal at the end, when it comes to recovering the money, that's something we are at present talking about in our Budgetary Control Committee. And it's really intolerable that the money can be wasted like that, that there can be this fraudulent activity and the money isn't even recovered. And as I said, it's a matter of the EU institutions really almost clamping down on the member states, and the appropriate control work being carried out all the way through to recovery. So there's the responsibility at the national and at the regional level as well, and as regards to various administrations involved. And when it comes to controls checking on public money being misspent, used fraudulently, etc. Of course, this is a concern of the Court of Auditors, and there has been a fair bit of work done, and hopefully there will be ever more work on the part of the Court of Auditors here. And on this basis, I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Colmfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of Parliament and guests. I'll just explain very briefly what we are, the Court of Auditors, for the people who don't know. We are the institution of the Union that audits implementation of the budget, including aspects relating to performance. So I'm from the area that looks at natural resources, including fisheries policy. And since the event is about IUU fishing, of course, this regulation just came into effect in 2010, so I'll tell you straight away, we haven't done an audit of this, of course, but we have done relevant work over the years, which I think we can learn lessons from it, and I'd like to talk about that. But the first thing I'd like to mention is that a report we did a very long time ago, in 1993, actually still has relevant messages. This is our special report 3 of 1993, which found that referred to similar problems that exist today, 20 years later. At the time, there was a level of overcapacity of the fleet of about 40%. Decommissioning of vessels was problematic because the aid wasn't correctly targeted. There were difficulties to measure the power ratings of boats, which is one of the key measures of capacity. And community aid wasn't being correctly targeted. And these are all criticisms that, to some extent, you can still make today, 20 years later. I think, excuse me, The Commission has recognised in its recent Green Paper that these problems to some extent still exist. Now, the most recent work we did in the area of fisheries management and fisheries controls resulted in a special report which we published a few years ago, Special Report 7 of 2007. This report was focused on control systems, inspection systems and sanction systems in member states. And as a result of this report, well, not directly as a result of it, but following this report, the Commission proposed a new revised improved control regulation which came into effect in 2010 at the same time as the IOU regulation. So I'd just like to go through briefly some of the main findings of that work. First, regarding records of catches. These are absolutely essential because if the Union doesn't know how much fish it catches, then it can't adequately set quotas and it can't adequately control its fisheries policy. And we found in 2007 that there were many, many problems all over the Union. Declaration data was incorrect, was incomplete, whether at logbook or landing declaration or sales notes. The systems for recording these catches was very flexible. Fishermen had 48 hours to declare, and if they found out that inspections were coming, we found that in practice they changed their declarations. There was a lack of reconciliation between sales data, logbooks and landing data. The technical specification, the technical margins for actually calculating catches were far too flexible. There was tolerances of 20% applied at various stages, which meant that a fisherman could under-declare by almost 40% and still be within the rules. There were inadequate cross-checks between the satellite data at the time and the actual records of catches. There was inadequate follow-up of anomalies. There was lack of, especially important, there was a lack of harmonization at EU level of, in fact, what weights of fish meant. Like if you caught cod in Poland and if you caught cod in Germany, these translated into different weights for records against quotas. So there are many, many specific problems like this. I could go on, but they all added up to create a huge amount of uncertainty over the accuracy of the catch data, which was a very significant problem for management of fisheries. Then this is at the level of the member state. At the level of the Commission services lacked some information. They could not at the time do very advanced checks on the quality of the data from the member states. There was anomalies between the total data coming in from the member states and the data at local and regional level at member states. Now, this was all to do with the catch data. The next area of our report dealt with inspections. These are the inspections of the fishery services, like the Italian Comandante. And we found that there were serious problems all over the Union. In some member states, the inspections were being carried out by various different services. At the time, the European regulations did not specify exactly what an inspection was, what you had to catch, how you should report it. So these inspections, fishery inspections, were being carried out to a different extent, to a different quality, to different standards all over the Union. So it was difficult for policymakers at the centre to know whether inspections were being adequately done. There was also serious problems with the reporting of the results of inspections. In some member states, they only reported inspection results if they found problems. In others, they didn't. So, again, policymakers, both at member state level and the central level, didn't know whether fisheries were being adequately inspected or not. Then there was problems with the quality of the inspections themselves. There was a lack of assurance that these inspections were being well performed. This is partly linked to the fact that there were inadequate procedures and standards for what was an inspection. And often inspectors didn't have access to, like we saw on the slide earlier, the impressive information you can get from the VMS, the satellite data. Often local inspectors couldn't get access to this, so they had problems to coordinate and plan their inspections adequately. And I'd like to refer back to something an earlier speaker said was the importance of risk analysis in planning your work. This was something, again, that was missing at the time. The community legislation and national implementing measures didn't pay adequate attention to how these inspections should be targeted. This is something that we were pleased to see has been improved a lot in the new control regulation. Then the next thing that our report dealt with was what happens when the inspections found problems. And there we weren't happy either, because we found that the level of sanctions imposed on non-compliant fishermen seemed to be inadequate. It couldn't have an impact because it was so low. We had difficulties in knowing how much sanctions were applied because they weren't adequately recorded. And also at the time, there was no minimum standard of what a sanction should be. Of course, member states know best how to manage their own business, but still at the European level, it didn't specify what kind of a minimum sanction there should be if fishermen didn't comply with the rules. This as well is something we're pleased to see has been treated in the new control regulation. And then another issue that we mentioned in our special report in 2007 was the huge effect of overcapacity, which led to, which was one of the key factors leading to the failure of the common fisheries policy at the time. I think the Commission recognised this as well. So I can't say much more about that today, except that overcapacity is an issue that the Court of Auditors is very concerned about, of the fishing fleet. It's an area that we have recently done some work on, and it's an area that we've recently given our initial opinion to the Commission services, and we intend over the before the end of the year, hopefully, to have a report on the subject. And then, if I could draw the whole thing together a little bit and refer to the relevance of our previous findings for IUU fishing. First, I can agree with what an earlier speaker said, that overcapacity of the fleet in some way encourages IUU fishing, or perhaps not encourages it, but it certainly is a risk factor. Also, our previous work relating to controls showed that it's very important to have, for the community regulations and then at member state implementation, to be very clear about standards for inspections and standards for controls so that everybody understands what should be done, who should do it, what's the minimum standard to do, how quality of work should be assured, and how we know that there's complete information on infringements. And I think these lessons from the control regime apply to the IUU regulation as well. So, of course, I can't say much more about IUU because we haven't audited the issue yet. But that would be my initial contribution. Thank you, Chairman.
Grazie a lei per il contributo.
Thank you very much to you for your contribution. We now have around 15 minutes for questions. Brief questions, please. So we'll try and get as many in as possible. Sir.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Madame, rather, excuse me. Yes, thank you, Chairman. So just to go back to what was said by our colleague, Mr. Pugh, the Commission, of course, shares the Pugh recommendations with regard to thinking more about the conditionalities attached to aid. And this is essential in the reform of the CFP, so we're currently reflecting on mechanisms that can be used and ways of reflecting these recommendations, i.e. if an operator commits an infraction, the assistance provided to this operator needs to be withdrawn, whether it's community aid or national aid. In addition, however, an operator does need to be put on an IUU list for that to happen. So in the future, what we're going to try and do is make sure that we can manage this kind of thing more easily. We're thinking about that at the moment. With regard to conditions, we've also decided not to give aid to people who have committed sanctions and have been punished. We also have cross-compliance, as it's known. i.e. if in the future serious offences are committed, operators will not receive any aid again, either national or community level. So these aspects are being considered with regard to being eligible for aid, and also with regard to the punishment side, i.e. if you do something illegal, then you can lose your rights to assistance, or at least have these rights suspended. All of this is currently being reflected on in the Commission. You'll soon have a proposal on the new CFP, and I think that, as Mrs. Amanaki said in her speech, these are some of the main points that the Commission wants to push. Now, with regard to the current situation, I don't want to give the impression that the Commission has done nothing right from the start. With regard to drift nets alone, the Commission has recovered 9 million euros under current programmes. When we saw that operators had taken funding for reconversion and continued to fish illegally with drift nets, then we took 9 million euros back from the Italian government because of that. So it's not that we've just sat there and done nothing. We haven't been completely passive. And the other point made by Mrs. Damanaki was that we have already, together with France, with regard to bluefin tuna, asked for action on ship owners who had committed crimes, not to be given assistance for ship vessels to be decommissioned. So that's another example. I'd also like to draw your attention to the fact that the Commission is currently asking civil society, i.e. NGOs and member states, to actively participate and help the Commission to identify these illegal activities, because under current regulations, if there is a suspicion of illegal activity, we can ask the member state to check whether this is going on, and we can ask the member state, pursuant to our current regulations, not to give aid to any operators who are involved in RUU activities. So these mechanisms are already in place, but we need evidence that RUU activities are going on, of course. And that's why, during a seminar on the 15th of February with NGOs, we encouraged NGOs to give us this kind of information. With regard to the Court of Auditors report, well, I'd like to greet our colleague from the Court of Auditors, and we welcome the work that the Court of Auditors did in 2007 on the gaps in our monitoring policy. Now, you can see the end of the process now with the adoption of the monitoring regulation, and the 5 recommendations made by the Court of Auditors: improving the methodology for inspection, improving data, strengthening inspections, strengthening the Commission's activities in situations when the CFP is not acted in accordance with, and are all things that we've taken account of. I'd also like to tell you something that our colleague perhaps didn't know, which is that on the 8th of April the Commission will be adopting a regulation that establishes all the modalities for the application of this monitoring regulation. So we're moving in that direction. We also support the recommendation from the Court of Auditors, other recommendations that may be made by the Court of Auditors. Thank you very much, Chairman. Yes, thank you, says the Chairman. Please try and speak more briefly than that, because many people want to speak. Yes, I am Fabrizio De Pascale, National Secretary of the Trade Union for those people who work in the fisheries sector in Italy. The data that have emerged today show the failure of the CFP during all these years, and this failure has been recognised by the Commission itself in its green paper in the first paragraph. This failure relates to the CFP in itself and also to the financial instruments to support the sector that have been put in place over the years. The risk that we run during these kinds of discussions is to think that all fishing is illegal and that it would be fair to not provide any financial assistance to the sector. Illegal fishing and subsidies are kind of all put in the same boat. Now, things shouldn't be seen in that light. The European fisheries policy needs to be in place and the fisheries sector needs to be supported. The European Parliament, expressing its opinion on the Green Paper, asked for an increase in the resources for the fisheries policy because the fisheries sector means work and income for hundreds of thousands of workers. You can't simply get rid of a sector from one moment to another. If you want to reduce its impact, you have to introduce social measures to support the workers in the sector. Reforming the CFP could be an opportunity to be used in order to defeat illegal fishing. It's an opportunity for the Parliament to really get involved much more than in the past, because we now have the co-decision procedure in which the Parliament plays a much more prominent role. This morning we met trade unions from other European countries in the ETF, the European Fisheries Trade Union, and we were asking for conditionalities, social conditionalities, to be placed in the reform of the CFP. i.e., we want to see any subsidies to the sector and to vessels and ship owners linked to a guarantee of employment and work conditions. Thank you very much. Thank you, says the Chairman. I share your concerns. But from our discussions, exactly what you say has emerged. We're committed to fighting illegal fishing and supporting legal fishing. So we're not running the risk that you brought up. Fighting illegal fishing means strengthening the legal sector in terms of jobs, saving the environment and avoiding economic costs. I hope that the trade unions are with us in this fight against illegal activities. The gentleman over there, and then my colleague.
Hello, my name is Hans van Skaren. I work for a Belgian Green MEP, Bart Staes. I have a question for the two gentlemen of Pew and fish subsidy. On the Belgian situation, we know that a lot of European fishery funds are being used to subsidize the beam trawling sector, which is around 19% of the Belgian fishery sector. And from an ecological point of view and also a sustainable point of view, it's absolute nonsense. But apart from being outraged morally about this, is this something we can attack, we can do something about? I mean, I'm not a specialist, that's why I'm asking this question.
Grazie per la domanda e anche...
Thank you for that question. Did you want to answer that?
Thank you, Luigi. I have two questions for Mr. Pietro. You were focusing a lot on drift nets, the legal way of fishing. Another way of illegal fishing is to fish above your quota. If you, and in some countries that is a huge problem. How difficult is it to find those fish? Because everything has to be landed someday. That's the positive thing, but it's very hard to see whether it's illegal or not. So maybe you can say a little bit more about that. My other question is, what kind of people are we dealing with? These illegal fishery activities, are these fishermen that also have some illegal activities, or are we talking about serious organized crime here? Thank you.
Grazie. Una domanda.
Thank you very much. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you. Saskia Richards from Greenpeace. Two quick questions. One is just noting very happily that there's big focus on conditionality, but I only heard the Commissioner mention that in relation to CFP rules, whereas conditionality for me applies much broader across environmental and social rules. So maybe the Commission can clarify what's going to be in the package. And the second question goes to Mr. Pistorio. I noted that you said that fishing with drift nets it follows an administrative fine rather than a criminal one unless you fish for undersized fish. Is there something in Italian legislation that prevents the Italian government from changing that and making it a criminal infringement? Thanks.
Prego.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, Chairman.
And I'm the rapporteur of the initiative report on the EU role in combating IUU fisheries on the global level. And thank you very much for organizing this seminar. It was very interesting, and I think indeed that the linkage between subsidies and IUU is very pertinent indeed. And I totally share the view that Marcus Knigge from Pew told us about, that, I mean, subsidies have indeed contributed to overcapacity, which in turn leads not only to overfishing, but also the temptation of illegal fisheries on a small scale and also in a large scale. And I just wanted to point to a few things that haven't been mentioned. We always talk about subsidies to construction of vessels, etc. But there's another large subsidy that is hidden, and that is the tax exemption from fuel. So that also is contributing to the overcapacity. The operation costs go down because you can actually use fuel that is costing 1/4 or 1/3 of what the price is on the market with tax on them. So that is also something that I think should be addressed in the reform of the common fisheries policy, and it hasn't been discussed as of yet. And also, when we talk about this from the, let's say, from the public point of view, we're talking about a common resource. Of course, the fish belongs to everyone. So when we have illegal fisheries, the general public is being, let's say, robbed at least 2 or 3 times around. Because first of all, we have environmental degradation because of overfishing and illegal fisheries. We have also tax evasion. I mean, these are incomes that should be declared for that fish, which does not happen. So I also would like to draw the attention of an initiative that has been brought up from Norway, actually, and that is to address the issue of illegal fisheries in the context of organized crime. Because we're talking about money laundering, we're talking about tax evasion, we're talking very often also about linkages to human trafficking, drug trafficking. It's indeed organized operation taking place around the world, and that also, if we consider this an organized crime activity, which is often is not always, because sometimes it is more of an administrative offense, but sometimes it really is organized crime, then that problem could be addressed under a different convention under the UN umbrella, and that's the UN Drugs and Crime Convention, which gives more space for addressing this problem between states than the FAO, which is the present forum for addressing these problems. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you. Final question, because then we want to hear the answers from the captain and others.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Matthew Gianni. I'm with the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition. I'm based in the Netherlands, but I've done some work in the past on the issue of IUU fishing. Just a very quick question to Mr. Thurston and possibly Mr. Friel, as well as the Commission, but was very disappointed to hear of the increasing lack of transparency. You mentioned in your presentation in regard to knowing where the money goes and who's getting it and what it's being spent on. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate, is the Commission the only body capable of getting this information from member states? Are there other means of getting this information? And potentially, is this something that could be corrected through the reform of the common fisheries policy? Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you. Now, very briefly for the replies, Pew Commander, in that order.
Just very briefly on the question from the gentleman over there on the Belgium situation. Basically, it's up to the member states how they use the funding. And if you want to see some of the patterns, I put a report over there. I'm not sure if there's still a copy left on the FIFG evaluation, which shows that most of the money, for instance, for modernization and construction went to the large vessels, while most of the money for small vessels went for scrapping. So you see certain patterns, and similar, there's also some allocation according to gear types. But I just want to reiterate what was brought up, and I think it is, from our perspective, one of the most important and immediate things that can be done now, which is actually the Commission asking for the information how subsidies are spent at the moment as we speak, because it is so difficult at member state level in all the different member states, all different legislation to make access to information requests, while at the same time we know there are serious problems, everyone is aware, and it seems almost that the Commission is not willing to ask for the information for some political reasons, despite the fact that member states fail to report on overcapacities and have serious implementation problems, apparently.
Grazie.
What can be done? Well, things would be a lot better if they were just rewound to where we were in relation to the years 1994 to 2006. But things could be improved beyond that in a number of ways. I think the information that was most lacking previously would be information on ownership and the companies involved in owning these vessels, because it's fairly concentrated. A lot of the fishing is done by a quite small number of vessels and an even smaller number of companies. And the way in which these vessels are owned and the company structures are extremely opaque. A group of journalists who I've been working with are doing a 9-month study on one sector of the European fishing economy involving a number of people, unpicking all of this thing. The complexity, it's Byzantine and often Byzantine for a reason, for deliberate obfuscation. And in relation to information, so that's information on subsidies. I think it's also important that we are more open about convictions. In my country, the United Kingdom, when the Coast Guard Service would convict a vessel, they used to put out a press release on their website saying, this is what we've done, we're earning our money, we've convicted this vessel, this is what happened, this is the fine, this is the vessel, this is what was done, and these were the sanctions, and these were the offences. I thought that was great, and so I took the information that had been published and then said with a Freedom of Information request, can I have all the previous information on convictions going back to the year 2000? Because they'd just done the most recent ones in that year. Suddenly, after I put that information request in, all the press releases disappeared from the Marine Fisheries Organisation website. And I was told, no, you can't have this information. It's the rights of the convicted people to remain private. They have paid their fines and have been absolved. We see no interest in naming and shaming them. They have paid their debt to society and they're free to carry on. And I think that's not really acceptable. There is certain crimes for which you could say that there needs to be confidentiality. Most often people think about sex crimes of one kind or another where there's a real possible risk that someone is going to have their house burnt down later on. But even in those cases, we do have sexual offenders registers that don't allow people who've been convicted of a sexual offence to teach in a school, and that kind of thing. I think we could do a lot more about openness of justice, because justice needs to be done, but justice also needs to be seen to be done. And sometimes seeing justice done can help increase compliance elsewhere amongst other people.
Grazie. Diamo la parola.
Thank you. Captain Pistoia?
Bene, allora rapidamente cercando di rispondere nel modo più conciso.
I'll try and be as brief as possible. Now, quotas. We're basically dealing with the bluefin tuna quota at the moment. Currently, the documents that need to be issued, the catch documents, are utterly sufficient, really, to know what's going on. But the problem is when relates to the checks that are carried out when a catch is unloaded. There are so many places where controls are carried out that not all of the checks actually happen, and that is, I suppose, normal because there are so many of them. But it's the splitting of the BCD that's the problem. There's a form that you need to have filled in to get the bluefin tuna, the tuna into the food chain and so on to sell it. But the difficulty does often relate to these checks. Now, fishermen, who are they? Well, they're men of the sea, old salts, and that's something that needs to be said. They live on the sea, and they work on the sea. But they're people like us. I mean, I suppose also their specific nature relates to the sector they're working in. But we're talking about men of the sea here. Now, I also wanted to answer the question on the administrative or criminal sanction. Now, currently, Italian law envisages the application of an administrative punishment. Now, I can tell you about the application of the provision, but I can't tell you why it's an administrative or criminal penalty. What I can tell you is that if there is a criminal responsibility established, the whole thing goes to the courts. But I can't tell you why it's not a criminal penalty. I can tell you about that, says the chairman. And as always, of course, this relates to political will. It's legislators that make a choice. And in Italy, they believed that an administrative punishment was sufficient. Speaking in my personal capacity, I believe that in the environmental sector, greater criminal punishments should be introduced. I'd also like to remind you, as the captain did earlier, how important it is to confiscate equipment. And this can often be extended. It's often not only the equipment that can be confiscated, but the fishing vessel itself. Let me now give the floor to my colleague Gerben-Jan Gerbrandi, who is the ALDE rapporteur on the Environment Committee's opinion on a very sensitive issue, combating IUU fisheries at the global level and the role of the EU. So I'll let him conclude and perhaps tell you a few new things as well. I'll also leave him the chair.
Thank you, Luigi, and I'd like to thank again all the speakers for being here and giving so much information. I must say, when I started in this parliament in 2009, since then I've had a few moments of amazement. Some of them are about the way things are organized within this house, but I won't bother you with that. The others are more relevant to what we're talking about. And I had these moments maybe more than in other fields in the fisheries field. A few months ago, I hosted a movie in the Environment Committee. It was a WWF movie about bluefin tuna catches. And it was about the way the French authorities were working together to sort of make illegal catches legal again. And I think that touches upon our main problem in the whole illegal fisheries issue, and also on the whole issue of fishing too much fish. It's the member states who are responsible for enforcement, controls, etc., etc., and they're just not doing their job. They're not interested. They have other interests that are more important to them than to continue catching fish for the coming decades. And they work together quite often with people who catch above quota or catch in an illegal way. And despite people like Mr. Pistorio, who are working hard to fight this thing, I think that that the way member states are working against a real good system of enforcement is one of the main problems. Therefore, I would like to give Commissioner Damanaki credit for what she's doing. I think she's doing a very good job at the moment within the Commission, certainly compared to some of her predecessors who were more advocating the interests of the fisheries sector than fighting for the common interest. I think the current Commissioner, Mrs. Damanaki, is absolutely on the right track. But she has the same difficulty that she's confronted with member states who are not willing to do what they are supposed to do. She has told about the December Council where the quota are set, that despite all the biological evidence that certain species should not be fished anymore, the member states continue trying to get higher quota. So I think, again, that is where our main problem lies. Looking at her presentation today, of course, I still have a few doubts about what she is saying. I think it's amazing to imagine that we're talking about a 10 billion euro market, the illegal fisheries, 20% of worldwide catches. It's almost impossible to believe that it's that large. I liked very much what she was saying about that it's unacceptable that public aid goes to vessels that have been caught of illegal practices. On the other hand, we heard other stories about this so-called black list, which is, as I understood, is in the hands of the regional management authorities. And, well, at the moment we have no vessels on it, and I hope in the summer we'll get a few. But it's a bit strange if you hear the stories from Mr. From Mr. Thurston of the fishsubsidies.org. You see the real figures about subsidies and illegal fishing and vessels that continue receiving subsidies. I think that is really unacceptable. And my question to the Commissioner would have been, but maybe some of the people here know the answer, how long will someone be on the black list? I mean, it's apparently extremely difficult to get on the black list, but even when you get that far, how long will someone be on the blacklist? I think it's so unacceptable that you continue receiving funds after being caught with illegal activities, that maybe we should keep companies a little bit longer on the blacklist. Another thing that I would put forward is the issue of transparency. I was shocked by the fact that we are going into the wrong direction when it concerns transparency. I'm a strong believer in transparency in general, not just on fisheries, but in general. It is the main tool we have the main controlling tool that we have. So as long as we don't have sufficient transparency, it's almost impossible for those organizations that are on the right track in controlling to do their job properly. Let me go through everything that has been said. I heard the Commissioner talk about trying to come to an international effort through the Regional Fisheries Organization to come to some sort of worldwide catch certification system. I think the idea is brilliant, very good idea. But if I see how difficult it is to come to international agreement on quota, for instance, bluefin tuna. I was in Japan at the end of October during the Nagoya Biodiversity Summit and had a meeting with members of the Japanese Parliament. And at the day that Japan made enormous offers to the summit, financial offers, other offers, to really come to a successful conclusion of the summit, my Japanese colleagues said that they would never allow any limitations in bluefin tuna quota because it was their culture. And, well, I think that is a serious problem. So getting this worldwide catch certification system, wonderful idea, but I hope that the Commissioner is going to receive any support from this from other parts of the world. Let me check what else I wanted to say. Yes, I believe subsidies play a decisive role in the way we are trying to get our oceans as empty as possible. There's a direct link between subsidies and overcapacity. I've seen it in my own country, the Netherlands, where vessels were taken out of business, but other vessels were modernized, and the end result was that the capacity was even larger than before. And it's very strange that we continue with these subsidies in this way. We have had several international agreements on phasing out environmentally harmful subsidies. We've had them on fossil fuels. The G20 made an agreement on this. But again, going back to Japan, the Nagoya Summit on Biodiversity, we agreed as European Union and all member states that by 2020 we have phased out all, and I emphasize this, all environmentally harmful subsidies. And I believe that's almost half of the whole fisheries budget that we have. So, and it might be even a much larger amount. That doesn't mean that we cannot use this money for very good reasons. Well, the gentleman from the Italian Fisheries Union has left, but I think that it's very wise to use the money to a large extent to find other economic or other income sources for people who work in the fisheries sector, because one thing is absolutely sure, we will have to go down in capacity. I would like to conclude with that. Enforcement by member states is a top priority. That is extremely difficult. It is not something that is difficult to understand. It's just very difficult to get it politically through. And I hope that not just within this European Parliament, but also in the member states, national parliamentarians will try to fight for this. And my final remark is on these subsidies. Please let us come up with a serious roadmap to get rid of all, not just in the fisheries environment, but all environmentally harmful subsidies. They are going against other policies, and that is something that we shouldn't do, especially in these times where we don't have sufficient money at all. Thank you.
Grazie. Grazie, una buona...
Thank you very much. Have a good evening, everyone.